Ethiopia electoral body has postponed parliamentary elections that were scheduled to take place on the 5th of June. The electoral body says it does not foresee any delay of more than 3 weeks. The Horn of Africa country was originally scheduled to hold the vote in August last year, but it was delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since then, there's been conflict in the northern region of Tigray, which will not take part in the voting, as well as in other areas. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his Prosperity Party faces the challenges from increasingly stringent ethnically based parties who are seeking more power for their regions. For some analysis on this, we are now joined via Zoom by Dr. Awol Allo, the senior lecturer at the University of Keele School of Law. Dr. Allo, very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thanks for having me.
Now, can Ethiopia really afford to have any more postponements of its parliamentary elections?
I think what we have now is not postponement, at least if we follow the official line. What they are saying is that they are postponing for a period of 2 to 3 weeks because of logistical reasons. Now, it's not clear whether this is genuinely for 2 to 3 weeks or whether the government is simply trying to find a way of extending it without exposing itself, because there has been persistent calls by political actors within Ethiopia and outside Ethiopia to postpone the election, because this election at the current time, at the time when the country is bogged down in civil war, various armed conflicts in various places, where several opposition political parties have boycotted the election, that this election would not be in the national interest. It would not address the kind of challenges that the government hopes it would address. So there have been calls on the government. The government has been rejecting those calls. The change in tone appears to have come after a visit by the U.S. Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa, Jeffrey Feltman, who seems to have engaged on broader questions or just in the conflict in the northern part of Tigray. So we don't really know whether this is just for 3 weeks for logistical reasons, as they say, or a more extended deferral of the election.
I mean, from what you've observed, when are we most likely to see the elections take place eventually in Ethiopia?
I think the country now is really tearing itself apart. The political conditions on the ground, security conditions in the ground are simply not conducive for elections. In order for an election to make any difference for a country like Ethiopia that finds itself in several conflicts in multiple fronts, not only Ethiopians fighting one another, but also a neighboring country, Eritrea, allowed to enter Ethiopian territory, fighting on the side of the Ethiopian government. We simply don't have the basic consensus that is necessary to hold an election that will lead the country somewhere. And a significant number of actors are saying what Ethiopia needs now is not an election that would certainly crown the incumbent, but a national dialogue process where all the stakeholders would come together around the table, agree on a path for Ethiopia's future. You have several opposition political parties. For example, if you take the Oromia regional state, there is no opposition representing the Oromo public that is participating in this election. The Tigray regional state is not part of the election. Election will not be held in several areas, for example, where you have a military command post. So the prospect of having a democratic election that would address the long-standing demands of the Ethiopian people is simply not there. What these elections do is basically force people to give up on a democratic process and take the country down the path of violence, which it is already on.
And speaking of the Tigray region that you've just mentioned now, which has declared that they will not be taking part in the elections, what does this mean then for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's influence? Will this not further complicate, his intentions of centralizing power?
Absolutely. I think what the Prime Minister and his government is concerned about, and the reason why they are pushing ahead with the election, is because there is this cloud of illegitimacy that is hanging over his head. Remember, the Prime Minister does not have a mandate from the public because he has never been elected. He inherited a mandate from a previous Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, a very questionable mandate, earned in 2015 when the government won 100% of the votes. After coming to power, the current Prime Minister actually dismissed that vote, and he said, we used terrorist methods to stay in power. So he himself questioned the mandate that grounds his own authority. Not only that, that mandate ended in October last year, and the government extended its term, basically using COVID-19 as an excuse. And that is roundly rejected by opposition politicians and various political actors in the country. So what the Prime Minister is really desperately seeking is to kind of address that question of illegitimacy that is hanging over his head. But the question is, they have instigated violence in several places. They have locked up credible opposition forces that represented an electoral threat to them, particularly in the Oromia regional state. So the possibility that this election would provide any legitimacy for the Prime Minister and his government is almost zero. And we also know that this election is not in the national interest, in the sense that it does not bring together the various political actors who are now fighting for different reasons. So if it is an election that is already considered to be sham, the outcome of which is already predetermined, if it is not in the national interest, this election would serve neither the interest of the Prime Minister and his government or the national interest. So because the international community has been putting significant pressure on the government recently, the European Union, for example, said they will not be sending an electoral observation mission because the election does not meet the basic minimum requirements. And when the European Union takes such a step against governments, which it usually doesn't do, it means you really have a significant problem. And the Americans are also signaling the same thing. So because the broader structural problem the country is facing is so immense, and it could likely lead to the disintegration of the Ethiopian state, I think the government is probably coming under pressure to postpone it. But as I said, the electoral board is saying that they are simply postponing this for a period of 2 to 3 weeks. It doesn't seem to be that is the case, but I think we have to wait and see in terms of whether this is this 3 weeks period or a longer period. But a longer period is probably what is likely to happen.
Yeah, sure, wait and see, we will. But then just back to the Prime Minister's future, I mean, considering the fact that his efforts of consolidating power in Ethiopia seem to be compromised, what does the future look for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his Prosperity Party in the body politic of Ethiopia as as a whole?
Yeah, so this was a prime minister who had a significant level of support from the public when he came to power, to the point that something referred to as Abimania was gripping Ethiopia at some point. And unfortunately, he wasted such a splendid opportunity to transition the Ethiopian state. He had a very particular vision of his own, which is to kind of make Ethiopia great again, returning the country back to a kind of a previous older period when some people believe Ethiopia had a glorious moment. But a significant majority of people in that country saw Ethiopia as a kind of imperial state that held various nations, nationalities, and peoples together by force. And it's an imperial state that is built on the exclusion of several ethnic groups, basically a state that celebrated the culture, language, or religion that belongs to one particular group. And what the struggle in Ethiopia over the last 15 years has been precisely about changing that model of a state. And the prime minister who came to power on the back of the struggle, mainly of the Oromo people, who were demanding for the right to self-determination, basically wanted to take the Ethiopian state back to the imperial era. he basically speaks of this great Ethiopian period where questions around ethnicity were not discussed in public, and the need for Ethiopia to return to that kind of model. That is a view that is simply not shared by a significant majority of the Ethiopian public. The Prosperity Party that he created is an institution structure that simply doesn't reflect the social cleavages and political fault lines that exist in Ethiopia. It doesn't speak to the contemporary concerns, demands, and desires of people on the street. So it was very clear when the Prosperity Party was established that this is not going to go anywhere. It, in fact, would put the transitional process in a different context. And as I think a lot of us suspected, it did. It led to a devastating war that is destroying the country. Clearly, it's very difficult to see after this war how Tigray, for example, would continue to be part of the Ethiopian state. I think the prime minister has damaged himself. He has significantly harmed the interests of the country. But again, I mean, going forward, it really depends on how he reconsiders his position and begins a process that is inclusive to take the country forward and also give himself and his party a chance in the future of the Ethiopian state. But if the plan, as we see, is simply to shove his particular vision of the future down the throat of the Ethiopian public, that is going to backfire, as it did in the last 40, 50 years. That is precisely what the Marxist-Leninist government did when it came to power in 1974. That provoked resistance by several ethno-nationalist groups, and that government fell down in 1991. TPLF tried to...
Dr. Allo, you've just touched on political inclusivity, and I suppose it is, political inclusivity has been very alien in Ethiopia, to say the least, because the jury is still out on whether inclusivity or political inclusivity will be a panacea for the crisis that is ravaging Ethiopia. But then constitutionally, what does this unsolicited postponement of the elections mean for the country? Could it likely, lead to the erosion or the degradation of the country's constitutional fabric?
I think the Constitution at this point is really no longer a kind of instrument that provides the terms of reference for the conduct of the state. The government itself doesn't appear to operate within the terms of the Constitution. We now have a situation where in these areas where you have military command posts, innocent citizens are being executed in public in a form of kind of a ritual celebration where people that government forces suspect of committing certain crimes would be taken to a public square and executed extrajudicially without any legal process. And this is, you have local government officials basically saying measure has been taken against this individual because it is found that he was associated with certain groups. There is nothing in the Constitution that allows public authorities, government officials to execute individuals. So the Constitution at the moment is no longer really serving the purpose that it was supposed to serve, and the government is acting extra constitutionally. And I think it's very difficult now to kind of situate ourselves and speak within the framework of the Constitution because the government itself dishonored the terms and the spirit of the Constitution. So what I think Ethiopia needs now is a political negotiation between all the relevant stakeholders in the country to agree a path forward. The Constitution mandates elections every 5 years. That election has already been postponed. But the conditions now are such that if you were to hold an election, it's clear that...
Unfortunately, Dr. Allo, we are out of time, but we do appreciate your time and for your well-thought-out analysis on this matter. That was Dr. Awol Allo, the senior lecturer at the University of Keele School of Law, just giving us and sharing with us his reflections on the developments coming out of Ethiopia. The country's elections have been postponed yet again.